The next morning, Ungent awoke in his quarters and was surprised at how well he'd slept. The previous night's meal and the evening entertainment performed in his honor must have been more relaxing than he imagined. And the bed. Ungent was amazed to see how carefully his hosts had followed the guidelines sent over by his homeworld government. Here he was, a single crustacean in an ocean of mammals, and yet every fixture in his quarters had been adapted to his needs. That even extended to the decor. The walls were paneled in dark neo-wood copies of traditional Grashardi bas-relief carvings, with their gracefully interlocking biomorphic shapes. To Ungent's eyes, they were attractive, sensuous, sophisticated. As such, they were the perfect complement to the rigid, scooped-out surfaces of solid Thanganese coral embossed with pewter glyphs that made up his tables, chairs, and broad ovoid bed. After a quick check of his chronometer, Ungent was relieved to see he'd woken right on schedule. Although he'd thought through his entire approach hundreds of times, he still felt his presentation of his government's trade policy needed a final polish. For one thing, he wondered how to express the Grashardi government's desire to extend favored trade status to Bledraun when the drawline barely had a word for treaty in their vocabulary. Isolated in a sideline galaxy, this curious people tended to see interstellar politics like a conversation between two neighbors over a backyard fence. As it happened, the drawline rarely used fences solely to mark property lines. They had a jittery relationship with the concept of land ownership. Ungent had seen the amused look on the faces of the drawline officials he'd contacted by holoscreen in the last few weeks. When they spoke of trade, land, and property rights, it was as if he could see the irony streaming from their round ears. In this case, he knew, he didn't have the option of saying each culture to its own. An essential part of Ungent's mission was making his hosts understand that any agreement between the two worlds would actually be binding. The drawline's sense of irony would earn them no leniency with the Sector Court of Appeals if their relationship with the Grashardi went south at a later date. The upcoming Interstellar Trade Conference would further complicate his mission. If nothing else, he could count on the noisy humans pushing their way into every discussion with both elbows out. Good luck easing the enigmatic drawline into a cozy relationship with the basic premise of interstellar trade negotiation, as long as brash Muffy McIntyre was in the room. As Ungent began unpacking his luggage, it occurred to him that the humans' bullying ways might be a side effect of their rapid rise to power. Pensive, he set aside his luggage and opened a file on the personal scanner embedded in his left forearm. It was a recent book by the renowned Grashardi historian Geldrad Sharik that Ungent had purchased before his trip to Bledraun. So far, he'd found one passage in The Human Conundrum especially enlightening. The first in the modern era to develop space-folding engines, the humans soon encountered hundreds of underdeveloped worlds, each pleading for help. As a result, as early as 3146 old-style, human advisors controlled government, finance, and commerce across a dozen galaxies. But by 3173, mounting societal pressures erupted in a backlash. Accounts of aliens with suspect values made human settlers fearful. In the same period, the pay gap between space workers and planetary workers, both on Earth and across its emerging colonies, fueled deep resentment. Soon after, a dip in the human space-based economy caused hardship for millions and spawned the revival of an ancient Earth religion. Within 2 cycles, a fringe political party emerged. By lacing its rhetoric with phrases from sacred texts, it was swept into power. 100 cycles of oppression followed as party leaders enforced a grotesque distortion of religious law. The prison population swelled. During this period, adherents of Earth's other surviving religions were utterly marginalized. To date, even as human society edges toward greater openness, no citizen who is not a member of the state religion holds a seat in government, the business council, or the science academy, nor a rank above sergeant in the military. Arrogant charlatans, Ungent grumbled. The rest of the settled universe, however, did not stand still. 5 cycles after the creation of the entity now known as the Terran Protectorate, the humans' tight-fisted reign took a hit. Grashard, an independent world, developed a spacefaring culture of its own. It offered less advanced societies fair trade partnerships and new technologies that threatened human dominance. Ungent's exoplated chest swelled with pride. The Grashardi had saved many fascinating worlds from being humanized. Finally, after several generations of losses, the Protectorate began to loosen its grip. While today this liberalizing trend continues, the humans' belligerent assumption of superiority has abated only slightly, nor have full civil liberties been extended to people of all faiths. Ungent closed the book file and shuddered. There had been a space of a few cycles where he thought the Protectorate might reform itself, but no more. It was now merely a well-oiled machine, whose function was to expand its borders. "Give them an opening, and my long journey will be for nothing," he said. And yet, in his relaxed state, Ungent had to ask himself whether any of his concerns were worth the worry. Based on what he'd seen so far, his hosts had a robust culture of their own. They'd developed a sophisticated society with accomplishments other species could equal but not surpass. He was sure the drawline, already bruised by the humans' brash behavior, would not be swayed a second time by false promises. A buzzing door chime knocked him out of his reverie. Good thing he was already half-dressed. There was nothing to do but throw a bathrobe of Toulousian silk around his exoplated shoulders and scurry over to the entryway. "Sorry to disturb you, Ambassador," came a meek voice through the intercom system, "but the Chaudron had a cancellation in her schedule and wondered if you could meet with her earlier than planned." Ungent fought hard to keep the irritation out of his voice. "How much earlier?" he asked. The answer, sorry to say, was immediately. With nothing to gain by protesting, even politely, Ungent agreed, closed contact, and finished dressing with unusual haste. Unusual, that is, for a settled Grashardi who took his morning rituals seriously. In spite of himself, he was soon wearing a lightweight tunic of deep lavender, studded with delicately carved dark hardwood buttons. This was topped with an ovoid zinc medallion embossed with 3 interlocking isosceles triangles, the symbol of the Grashard Sidereal Caucus. Black pants in brushed pseudo-cotton and a band of purplish coral running down each seam completed his decidedly non-human look. As he turned to face the mirror embedded in his closet door, a faint twinkle appeared in his eyes. "The moment of reckoning," he muttered. His reflection, of an aging diplomat who still looked smart in his form-fitting official garb, almost lifted his spirits. Over this he threw a thin, hooded cloak of indigo neo-suede, which, in his haste, took more than one try to fasten at the neck. "Thought they were supposed to be a relaxed people," he grumbled, and then forced himself to stop. The last thing he needed was for the Chaudron to catch the slightest hint of resentment, unless his secret goal was to return to the charade of marital affection waiting for him back home. Ungent took a deep breath and, 2 minutes later, crossed the wide courtyard that separated the embassy from the world government's disarmingly modest administrative offices. By the time he appeared before Chaudron Drashna, his composure was as calm as the waters of the Rytha Spa on his homeworld. As soon as Ungent arrived, a timid functionary showed him into Drashna's elaborately appointed office. As the distinguished crustacean couldn't fail to notice, the room was decorated in exquisite detail, down to the fine brocade curtains trimmed in Lathadrani satin. "Ambassador Draaf," said the drawline leader, "I'm mortified to disturb you on your first morning on Bledraun. Please sit." She pointed a slate-gray, furry finger at a soft mauve cushion to the left of her stainless steel desk. Ungent nodded, but remained standing. The cushion, deliciously comfortable for a furry mammal, would have been torture for his stiff crustacean contours. But if the drawline's senior leader noticed Ungent's dilemma, it didn't show on her broad face. "We have among us an unruly individual," the Chaudron began. "A child, actually, who resists every attempt to discipline him." Ungent paused a moment to take in Drashna's severe appearance, dressed as she was in dark russet neo-leather jumpsuit embroidered here and there with teal accents. "Children can be troublesome at any age," he said. "However, I hardly have the qualifications—" Yes, said Drashna with a wave of her hand. "We already have tutors, nurses, and recreational directors who can deal with the boy's education. What we need is someone to guide him towards what I believe you would call manners. Well, Ungent started. He hadn't spent 6 weeks in a sublight ship to become a nanny. We assume, as a diplomat, the 40th drawline female said, you must have special insight that would enable you to teach the boy a more productive way of expressing his emotions. Ungent looked over at the frustrated face in front of him that no amount of swirling fur could hide. He saw he'd have to take a stab at meeting this unusual request. Refusing outright would throw his diplomatic mission straight off course. Besides, the Chaudron was only asking him to try. As it happened, Ungent wasn't so inexperienced with these matters. Florent had given him 3 to 4 years of practice in dealing with irritable teenagers. From what he'd heard so far, the problems of adolescence among sentient species were fairly universal. "Where is the boy from?" asked Ungent. There was, he realized, no time like the present to start cooperating. Drashna consulted her own personal scanner, which was remarkably similar to Ungent's. Province of Thulintran, she said. Ungent's eyelids blinked in a quizzical pattern. That's a Krezovic province, he gulped, on one of their colony worlds. Might have known you would recognize that, said Drashna. She was smiling that peculiar brand of drawline smile that many other species would swear was a snarl. I am, if nothing else, said Ungent, who smiled back, a being of the universe. Of course, for a crustacean, that simple gesture required considerably more effort than for any member of a typical mammalian species. Unfortunately for all sentient crustaceans, a variation on the smile was one of the settled world's most universal gestures. Some of Ungent's colleagues in the diplomatic corps had gone so far as to have reconstructive surgery to make smiling less of an ordeal, but Ungent was totally old school. He'd long ago mastered the rigorous discipline of exoplate dislocation necessary to raise the corners of his mouth. So it should be no trouble, Drashna was saying now, for you to begin your first session with the boy in, say, the next 2 rotations? I'll bet that gives a seasoned veteran like you plenty of time to settle in. Of course, said Ungent, cursing his fate. Why was there always a price to pay for everything? With a bow, the Grashardi diplomat made ready to return to his quarters until the Chaudron remarked that, in the meantime, her team would transfer the Krezovic boy to the quarters adjoining his own. We'll have him all settled in before you meet him, said Drashna. Stunned, Ungent nevertheless still managed to recall the question that had been hanging in the back of his mind since this conversation began. By the way, Chaudron, he said in a low voice, what's the boy's name? The leader of the drawline stood tall, raised her furry arms, and laid her broad hands on the crustacean's purplish shoulders. That, Ambassador, is one of the problems, she told him. What's his name? The boy categorically refuses to say.